What is going on, guys? My name is Aaron, and this is the Game Day Hour. Welcome back to another fantasy football division review, and today we are taking a look at the AFC East. Of all the divisions I've looked at so far, and I've only looked at two, this will be my third. This to me is one of the most loaded divisions by player for fantasy football. So this should be a very interesting episode. I've seen a lot of points scored, and when I was looking over a lot of these notes, there is so many players in the top 20, a lot in the top 10 of their own position ranking. So this is going to be a very interesting search and see where I want to put these players. As you guys know the rules, what we do in this series is that we take a look at the four teams within this division, and the four today we're looking at are the New England Patriots, the New York Jets, the Miami Dolphins, and the Buffalo Bills. With all of these teams to look at, we're going to see where these players, how they matched up from last season, and where I think they're going to be drafted in your NFL draft, depending on which round. And we're doing this off of the tier list maker, of course. We have 28 players that we're looking at, so I hope you guys are getting excited. And if this is your team that you're hearing or seeing, tell me what you think about my list and give me your opinions in the comment section below. Anyways, let's get started. Also, again, before we get started, I basically got everything set up. Backdrop, microphone, laptop. I got the lights over here and the new camera with the whole new setup, desk and chair. So we're basically ready to go. And this is going to be the type of setup you see for a pretty long time. And I'm very excited because I like the setup. It's very comfortable and it looks great. So yeah, feeling confident. Let's get into the tier list. All right, now we're in the tier list maker, and as I said, we have 28 players that we're looking at this time around, and we got 8 Patriots, 6 New York Jets, 8 Dolphins, and 6 Bills. There's been a lot of movement in this division, so there's a lot of new pieces that we're going to be taking a look at, and of course, we're beginning with the New England Patriots. First player we're looking at is Jacoby Brissett, who is currently number 1 on the New England Patriots depth charts for the quarterback position, even though they just got Drake May in the draft. When I look at Jacoby Brissett, he's a journeyman. He's been all over the league, and recently he was with Washington last season, and while he didn't get many starts, in his starts he did play a little impressive, had a pretty good game against the New York Jets. So let's see how he did last season. Last season, he had 224 passing yards and 3 touchdowns in just a few games, so didn't turn the ball over. Obviously, that's not going to be good enough to be on fantasy. We're not going to be taking a look at that. But, Jacoby is a solid quarterback for New England, but as far as fantasy goes, we're probably about to walk into another Minnesota Vikings situation, and I would actually have him as an undrafted, yet I wouldn't call him a high free agent, but if he does have like a good set of games and there's injuries, he could be used. I'm not sure. I guess we're just going to have to see and find out. So having that there, it's pretty good. Jacoby Brissett is a solid quarterback, but not for fantasy. But who could be potentially replacing him is the New England Patriots' 3rd overall pick, Drake May. Drake May was super impressive with North Carolina last season, and at some points was for the Heisman conversation, and could have been as high as the number 2 pick in the draft. But he fell to number 3, and that was New England, and in his last season at North Carolina, he had 3,608 passing yards with 449 rushing yards, a total of 33 touchdowns, and only 9 interceptions. That's very impressive. And of course, he's coming off of Sam Howell, who was recently with Washington, and I thought Drake May was going to Washington, but clearly I was wrong. So he's with New England, and because Brissett has the nod, now if he does become the full-time starter, he could be considered a high free agent, but there's only one quarterback, or actually really 2 quarterbacks I would waste a draft pick on for rookies, and those are the first 2 overall picks, Caleb Williams and potentially Jaden Daniels. But after that, I don't know if I would pick up a quarterback in the draft of any rookie so far this year, even though there was a really good class of quarterbacks coming in for the NFL draft. So far New England is 0 for 2 on draft picks. Next up, with the running back core, we have Ramondre Stevenson. Now, Stevenson wasn't even the best back on New England last season. That was Ezekiel Elliott, who went back to Dallas. Rondé Stevenson had 619 rushing yards, 4 total touchdowns, and only 99 fantasy points. That's 35th. Now, I mean, it's still top 40, could be draftable. But New England, I mean, their team overall, this is the more underwhelming team to look at. And because of this, New England is going to get on the board, but not on a high draft pick. Now, I thought he was going to be a lot better. I mean, the season prior, he was a lot better, and I had a lot of faith going into this most previous season. But sharing the backfield with Ezekiel Elliott and his production going down is making me a little skeptical. And now he has to share it with Antonio Gibson. Gibson last season for Washington had 265 rushing yards, 389 receiving yards, 3 total touchdowns, only 66 fantasy points. That was 45th among all running backs. I'm starting to give up on Gibson. I drafted him last season, and I only kept him for like 1 start, and then I was done with him. So again, another player who is going into the undrafted list. I'm not even going to waste time with that. Now, another underwhelming situation is the wide receiver core. It's all over the place, so much to the point where Juju Smith-Schuster is the 5th wide receiver on the depth charts, which is just kind of odd to me. But the number 1 is Kendrick Bourne. Last season, he had 406 receiving yards and only 4 touchdowns. I'm not really looking at that in fantasy, but that's not that impressive. And likewise, the second receiver is Demario Douglas, who had 561 receiving yards and no touchdowns. I mean, maybe it was because Mac Jones wasn't really doing well last season, but man, are these receivers underwhelming, and neither of which are getting the nod. So if you're a New England Patriots fan, ouch. I mean, Drake May could be big, and he could be a high free agent. The rest, I'm not confident in drafting nor having as high free agents. And then you get to Hunter Henry. Now, Hunter Henry, I would say, is the best player on that offense. Last season, he had 419 receiving yards, 6 total touchdowns, and 72 fantasy points, which was 14th among all tight ends. So he is definitely a draftable player. He's a tight end too. And again, late rounds, you're not really going to get that many tight ends early on because more emphasis is going to be on running backs and receivers. So tight ends kind of get a backseat. So he's a high round 10, 11 guy, I would say, if you're doing those type of leagues with 2 tight ends. I would say it's a good place to have it. And now that Mike Gesicki is with Cincinnati, he is the lone star tight end for New England. He could be higher, but for now, I'm going to keep him in the round 10s. And then lastly, you got the New England Patriots defense. Now, track record suggests New England's defense is dominant and good. And they do have a pretty good roster, but they've lost some pieces. And last season, they only put up 138 fantasy points. That's 25th out of 32 defenses. So again, it is unfortunate. Yeah, I can't pull the trigger on that one. Because defenses are becoming more loaded all around them, New England's defense is just kind of starting to fizzle out. So again, they could be a high free agent defense, maybe one that you kind of select throughout the season, because most of the time players are just going to cycle through defenses. So New England might be cycled around a few times, but I don't really see them being drafted in many scenarios. So that is 6 Patriots in the high free agency undrafted mark. Only 2 are selected, and they are late rounders, Ramondre Stevenson and Hunter Henry. So sorry, New England, it's not as impressive as it looks. And then we get on to the New York Jets. First player we're looking at for the New York Jets is future Hall of Famer Aaron Rodgers. Now, Rodgers was supposed to be the full-time starter last season for the Jets, but went down with an Achilles injury in Week 1 just in his first drive alone. So he is not going to have any stats to look at, but if you know Aaron Rodgers, you know there's no scenario in which you don't draft this guy. He's going to be drafted in most leagues. I would say that Aaron Rodgers is a late 8 and 9 draft pick. He's already getting higher than all these Patriot players who have stats over him, but of course we know how Aaron Rodgers operates, and he has a lot of weapons around him. I think he's going to have a killer season, but most people are probably going to be 8 and 9 and have Rodgers as the second quarterback on their team as a QB2. So, good start for the Jets. And then you got Breece Hall, one of my MVPs for fantasy football last season. I drafted him in the 6th round last year, and wow, was it the steal of the draft. Because even though he was supposed to start off the year injured, once I started playing him a little more often, towards the turn of the year, like midway through, he started having an electrifying season. Last year, Breece Hall put up 994 rushing yards, 591 receiving yards, 9 total touchdowns, 198 fantasy points. That was 6th among all running backs in fantasy football. So, the question is, does he break 1 and 2? Not yet. But I think now you're going to see him start going in the 3rd round, maybe really early in the 4th round. I think he is going to be so reliable for the New York Jets. And this is a really good spot for him, and I'm happy for him because he was one of my favorite players to watch last year. A lot of red zone situations and a lot of burst runs. He did amazing. And the year prior, he had a pretty bad injury. So he rebounded very well. And under Aaron Rodgers, I think he's going to be used so well to the point where he doesn't have a lot of touches, and he's still going to put up a lot of great stats and points for fantasy. Rounds 3 through 5 is a great place to have Breece Hall. Next up, we have Garrett Wilson. Poor Garrett Wilson. An incredible talent, but of course we know his problem. Last year, he had Zach Wilson throwing to him, and so he didn't have that many impressive stats. With that said, though, he did have 1,042 receiving yards, but he only had 3 touchdowns overall throughout the year. That made him 36th in fantasy with 114 fantasy points. So he put up wide receiver 3 and 4 numbers, but he didn't have the quarterback that was needed. So the rookie of the year, for me personally, I just think that he is a mid-round pick. You can't put him low because now he's going to have Aaron Rodgers, hopefully, for the entire year. And if he does, I mean, that's going to be huge for the Jets, and it's going to be huge for him. His production should go up, and he should be seeing the end zone a lot more. So round 6 through 9 is a good place to have Garrett Wilson. But then the Jets also got Mike Williams. And Mike Williams has always been a solid wide receiver too, whether he was with Pittsburgh, whether he was with Los Angeles. And even though his season was cut short, he had 249 receiving yards and a touchdown. Of course, that injury against Minnesota took him out for the rest of the year. But he's back. He has Aaron Rodgers throwing to him, and he is definitely somebody I would draft, but somewhere right there. I mean, if Garrett Wilson is going to be round 6 through 9, then Mike Williams kind of needs to be in that spot. He's still going to be very reliable, and if he stays healthy, he could be very underrated going into this season and a good pickup to have in the late rounds, but we'll see. Then we got Tyler Conklin. And obviously, I'm not huge on the tight ends after Hunter Henry. Tyler Conklin had 621 receiving yards and 54 fantasy points. That was 23rd. Obviously, he did not touch the end zone. And he's going to be the only Jet on this list to not be drafted. So, poor guys. But, yeah, he's not somebody I would draft. I kind of wish that the New York Jets got Brock Bowers, because if they got Bowers, I would feel like this offense is unstoppable. But they didn't, and while I think Conklin can do better this season under Aaron Rodgers, I'm still not drafting him. And then lastly, the New York Jets defense, who I picked up after week 1 or 2, somewhere in there, because I had the Bengals defense with the Niners. I then got the Niners and the Jets, and oh my god, was I so lucky to pick this, because the Jets defense last year had 187 fantasy points, which was 4th among all defenses. For a team that had a poor record and a terrible offense, their defense was incredible. And I think under Aaron Rodgers, their defense is going to do a lot better. The Jets, to me, are here in round 6 through 9. Their defense is incredible, and I think that they are somebody that you should draft. So, a better team overall, the Jets are, than the New England Patriots. Breece Hall, round 3 through 5. Garrett Wilson, the Jets defense, Aaron Rodgers are in the 6 through 9s. Mike Williams in between 10 and 15, and then only Conklin is the only guy who I wouldn't draft. But other than that, the Jets are amazing. And now we got the Miami Dolphins. And the reason why I whispered this is because if you wanted to talk about a gold mine for fantasy football of any team, it was the Miami Dolphins. Their team in fantasy last season was unreal. So we gotta take a look at this. First off, we're starting with Tua Tagovailoa, who had his best season statistically, even though the end of it wasn't very great. Last season, he had 4,624 passing yards, 29 total touchdowns, 14 interceptions. Ouch. That's a little difficult, but he had 318 fantasy points. That was top 10 at number 10. And so Tua has started to gain traction as a potential QB1 for fantasy football. And because of this, it's going to be probably in the 4th or the 5th round, but he is somewhere in here. Tua has the opportunity to be a low QB1, a high QB2, and the reason why you got to pick him is because look at the offense they run. It's unbelievable. The Dolphins had the most points in a game last season with 70 points, and he went off in that game. And then next you got Raheem Mostert. Now, I didn't pay attention to Mostert's stats throughout the year. I kind of thought that it was Devon Achane, or Achane, I don't know how you pronounce his last name. That was like the biggest running back to look at. But then I took a look at the stats of Mostert, and I could not believe what I saw. 1,012 rushing yards, 21 total touchdowns. Wow. 231 fantasy points. That was second behind Christian McCaffrey. So Mostert had himself an electrifying season, but I'm running into the Detroit Lions dilemma. He's in the backfield with another great running back, and split production is something that I'm always concerned about in fantasy football. I generally don't like picking running backs that share the backfield. I like cowbells to go all in with some of these running backs. So where would I put Raheem Mostert? I mean, if he's going to get the nod in the end zone, or in the red zone, then he's a late round 4-5 pick, but because of that production, I can't ignore it. That's kind of a place I would like to see. And even though Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, they did pretty well last season, I had them 6 through 9 because they were very equal, but not explosive like Raheem Mostert was. As for Devon Achane, he had 800 rushing yards on the dot, 11 total touchdowns, 157 fantasy points. That was 18th. That's an RB2, RB3 level running back. But because you see the rest of the Dolphins offense, I'm going to kind of split like the Detroit Lions, and I would say he is a high round 10 through 15 guy, probably just right at round 10. He could be picked higher, but I just think there's still a lot of running backs going on the board. Plus, I wouldn't be picking a lot of running backs in between 6 and 9. That's more of a receiver QB2 defense area to pick at. So 10 through 15 is where I would have them. So that running back core for Miami is actually incredible. And they rival Detroit. They could have the most explosive running back core. Now we take a look at potentially the best receiving core in all of football, starting with Tyreek Hill. Last season was just spectacular. 1,799 receiving yards, 13 touchdowns, 251 fantasy points. That was second among all receivers behind CeeDee Lamb. Tyreek Hill is a round 1 pick, and there's no questions about it. He is clearly at this level. He's always been at this level. I mean, he's the best deep threat wide receiver in the league, the fastest wide receiver in the league, one of the best route runners you'll see, and Tua's favorite target. So Tyreek Hill, he's going to put up monstrous numbers like he always does if he stays fully healthy. And I got lucky because I had to play him and Tua in the championship game, and the Ravens defense saved me from potentially getting blown out with those two players. So I won thanks to the Baltimore Ravens in many cases, but if it didn't go the way I wanted to, there's a chance I may not have this trophy. So that's how dominant Tyreek Hill and Tua were. And then we got Jalen Waddle, who also put up 1,014 receiving yards, but he only had 4 touchdowns, which gave him 121 fantasy points. That's 30th. So I'm big on Waddle. I made a mistake in trading him away one of the seasons. So I'm going to put him somewhere here. I think that he is still a very high draft pick. I would say round 7 is where you're zoning to get him. He's kind of sitting in that same range as T. Higgins and Devonta Smith. So putting him in there is a very special place. Those are like where wide receiver 2s can put up wide receiver 1 numbers. So maybe he'll have a better season. We'll see. I mean, not getting in the end zone as much as he did. That's a little confusing to me, but it's okay. And now we got OBJ, Odell Beckham Jr. Last season with Baltimore, he had 565 receiving yards and only 3 touchdowns. He wasn't on many fantasy football lists. Odell is kind of past his prime, and he's just better as a third or sometimes a second, depending. And he's here as a high free agent, but I don't think many teams are going to draft him. I don't think so. But he's still going to be very reliable to Tua and all of them. Next up, you got Jonnu Smith. 582 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, 69 fantasy points. That was 16th among all tight ends. So he kind of hid in the shadows underneath Kyle Pitts, and now he's finally the number 1. But he's really, really late in my opinion. But still, somebody for the tight end position that you can potentially draft, but he's sitting on round 15 going undrafted. And then we got the Miami Dolphins defense, who last year had 185 fantasy points. That was 5th among all defenses. So, like the Jets, the Dolphins do have a lot of firepower. And even though they lost some pieces, I would still say that they are somewhere in the 6 through 9s as a defense that you would want to have early on. So yeah, it's good to have the Dolphins here. And I mean, look at Miami. Tyreek Hill passes into the rounds 1 through 2, clearly a round 1 pick, with Tua and Raheem Mostert in the rounds 3 through 5, Jalen Waddle in the Miami Dolphins defense in rounds 6 through 9, Devon Achane and Jonnu Smith are slightly, barely drafted, and then OBJ, because he's kind of past his prime and a third guy, he's going to be a high free agent. And now, the winners of the AFC East last season, and for a few seasons now, the Buffalo Bills. No other place to start than the quarterback position for Buffalo, and that is Josh Allen. Since 2020, Josh Allen has been a prime fantasy football quarterback. The year that they got Stephon Diggs, Josh Allen was my number 1 going into the season. And on this list, where my thumb is my championship, because I had Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs. That was their first year, and they basically won me the championship. They were my MVPs. So I have a very big liking for Josh Allen, but I have to say I'm a little concerned because Stephon Diggs is gone, and I'm looking at the receiving core, and it's just, it doesn't look that great. But last season, he had 4,306 passing yards with 524 rushing yards, 44 total touchdowns, 18 intercept. That's crazy. And he had 438 fantasy points. The best quarterback in fantasy football under those numbers. But the interceptions are a concern because he is a super hot or a slightly cold type player. He's not going to be in between. Josh Allen, of course, he's going to be somebody you're going to want to draft. And even though his receiving core is kind of lacking, until further notice, he is a round 2, a late quarterback to draft along with a few others. I think that his fantasy numbers just cannot be ignored, and being up in rounds 1 through 2 is important for him. I still think that anybody who gets him is just going to have incredible production because of his versatility. So Josh Allen being in the early rounds makes sense to me. Then you have James Cook. James Cook last season, it was kind of interesting. He had 1,122 rushing yards with 445 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns. He had 175 fantasy points. That was 12th among all running backs. They're going to rely on him a lot this year because of the lacking in the receiving core. He could even lead receiving yards potentially. I'm going to say he's somewhere in the round 6 through 9, pretty high. I do think he got way better, and last season was his best year. So James Cook being in that position makes sense to me. The number 1 receiver on the depth chart now that Stephon Diggs is gone is Khalil Shakir, who last season had 611 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Okay? It doesn't sound that great, but I do think that now that he is in that early rotation, he is potentially somebody to draft. But man, did the Bills receiving core really blow up this year. And the second receiver is their second-round draft pick, Keon Coleman from Michigan State and Florida State, who last season for Florida State had 658 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns, so he is a red zone threat. He could end up becoming the number one receiver on this depth chart, but until further notice, because I already put Khalil Shakir very low in the rounds 10 through 15, he is somebody who I think is going to be a high free agent, but somebody I would not draft because I'm a little skeptical, and there's only a few rookies I'll give that nod to. And with the receiving core being as bad as it is, it's just, there's a lot of question marks that are going to be put right there. And then next up is the second year tight end, Dalton Kincaid. And last season, he had 673 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 71 fantasy points. That was 15th among all tight ends. So he is, now that he's in the tight end 1 position for Buffalo, I do think his production is going to go up big time this year because Josh Allen is going to really need that tight end play. And because of that, I think that he is going to jump up to the round 6 through 9 and put up probably a monstrous year, get a lot more touchdowns than he did the year prior. And then lastly, we have the Bills defense. Now, the Bills defense was third in fantasy football with 197 fantasy points, but they did lose a few pieces as well, and I do think their defense got worse. The Bills, to me, are no longer... I mean, okay, that's a lie. They're still a top defense, but I'm going to put them here at the late round 6 through 9. I just think that losing some pieces ain't going to help, and Josh Allen's going to have to do a lot more, which is also solidifying why he should be in the first 2 rounds. And that will do the list all together. I know I've been doing each team individually, but we're going to do this all together. The undrafted free agents, or the high free agents, include Tyler Conklin, Keon Coleman, Odell Beckham Jr., the Patriots defense, Jacoby Brissett, Drake May, Antonio Gibson, Kendrick Bourne, and lastly, Demario Douglas. And that is just kind of a whole Patriots land down there, so I feel bad for New England. The late picks in rounds 10 through 15 I reserved for Devon Achane, Hunter Henry, Mike Williams, Ramondre Stevenson, Jonnu Smith, and lastly, Khalil Shakir. The round 6 through 9 has a lot of picks, but I went with Garrett Wilson, James Cook, Jalen Waddle, the Jets defense, Dalton Kincaid, the Miami Dolphins defense, Aaron Rodgers, and the Bills defense. Rounds 3 through 5, we got Breece Hall, who I'm super excited for, Tua Tagovailoa, and Raheem Mostert, who had one of the most incredible years last year. And then rounds 1 through 2, a clear-cut round 1 is Tyreek Hill, and then in the first 2 rounds, you still should see Josh Allen being selected pretty high. So that is the list. Again, it was very star-studded, but I didn't realize how lopsided New England was. New England has some ways to go. They're a very young team, and they need more work in free agency and the draft. Under Gerard Mayo, I do think their team will get better, but it's going to take some time. So this year, I'm not expecting too much. But the other teams, though, is going to be a dogfight for the first overall spot in that division. So expect a lot of fantasy production from the AFC East. Let's get on to the outro. And that will do it for today's episode. The AFC East is something that's going to be very fun to look at and a very interesting division next year. So I'm very excited for any team that's in that division. And the next fantasy football division review is going to be in the NFC East with my Dallas Cowboys and my least favorite teams of them all, the Philadelphia Eagles, the New York Giants, and the Washington Commanders. So that one's also going to be star-studded, and I can't wait to show off that list. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and if you do, please leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe. Go follow me on all my social medias, and go check me out in the YouTube Shorts. I tend to make shorts to interact with you guys so I can get opinions on how to look at future fantasy football lists while also interacting about your favorite teams. So that's something that's going to be fun. I want you guys to interact with me if you can. And share this video. I do want these to be guides for some people when they do their fantasy football list. That's kind of why I'm making these episodes. So it should be fun to have the fantasy football year we're about to have. And all I got is 5 more episodes to go after this. And once those 5 episodes are done, we can prepare for the fantasy year as the NFL season looms closer. So yeah, and that will do it for me. I hope you guys have a great day. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.